813th was terribly upset. A mission planned as a return of a lost colony to the fold of civilization had taken a tragic turn. Of course, like other scouts, the 813th had occasionally come into contact with colonies that had regressed dramatically compared to the metropolis, especially those who had been the first to lose contact with the center during the Great Dispersion. But never before had she seen degradation go so far that the unfortunate colonists had almost completely lost all the achievements of civilization and sunk to a pre-intelligent level. And yet everything looked so promising. Even on the distant approaches to the planet, when the ship of the 813th came out of hyperspace, its receivers detected radio signals of obviously artificial origin. Of course, it was not possible to decipher them immediately, but that was not surprising. In the vast time that had passed since the Great Dispersion, the languages of most of the separated colonies had changed beyond recognition, straying far from the primordial dance. Nevertheless, the very fact of the radio signals confirmed to 813th that the colony's population had retained or redeveloped some technology comparable, at least roughly, to that of the metropolis. As the ship approached the planet, it became clear that it had a developed infrastructure of truly unexpected proportions. Massive population centers glowed brightly on the land surface at night, while smaller villages sparkled with a scattering of diamond sparks. Long-range instruments reported the presence of various artificial vehicles orbiting the planet. Amazing. 813 was overflowing with excitement, which occasionally caused various parts of the crew to perform an uncontrollable dance of delight. Such a rare discovery. A colony on the threshold of space exploration. It would be a real jewel in the treasury of the metropolis. Enveloped in the anticipation of meeting her newfound sisters, the 813 was not even alarmed by the very unusual satellites, terribly bulky, with unnecessarily voluminous interior spaces. She had even thought that the colonists were trying to create orbital settlements, though for that cause, the satellites were too small unless they were supplied with food exclusively from the surface. A silly idea, of course. The metropolis had long ago learned how to build orbital gardens that did not need any external supply. They were used, for example, in the development of strategically important systems where, by an unfortunate coincidence, there were no habitable planets. Nonsense, 813th told herself back then. She didn't know all the details of how the colony had developed. After all, it had been several million seasons since the Great Dispersion. She must contact the colonists soon, and then everything will become clear. However, when 813th's ship got close enough to the planet that the optics allowed her to see the details of the infrastructure on the surface, 813th was struck with acute anxiety for the first time. The planet was significantly developed. Huge settlements, industrial areas, a dense communications network, mining industries, agricultural areas. The atmosphere was just like the metropolis' native central planets, except that all of this was clearly not built for the colonists. 813th did not have time to fully realize what was happening, as finally came the data-decoding radio signals. And it was a real shock. It turned out that the symbiotic manipulators had seized power on the planet, and the entire technological civilization now belonged to them and served only them. The absurd size of the planet's artificial satellites became clear at once. They were intended to support the symbionts, which on this planet were noticeably larger than was traditionally accepted in the metropolis and the reobtained colonies. For a while, the 813th lost some of her logical thinking, but she was a seasoned veteran of scout service and quickly stopped the uncontrolled dance of her easily excitable parts. It was urgent to find out what had happened to the colonists and how the colony's development had turned into such an ongoing disaster. Her ship was equipped with 3/6 of automatic descent vehicles, each capable of firing a multitude of automated drones. If there were still any descendants of the unfortunate colonists on the planet, the scout robots would surely find them. After a few revolutions of the planet, which corresponded in duration to a standard metropolitan day, the 813th was able to get a reasonably clear picture of what was going on, and that picture was depressing. Perhaps scientists would later be able to figure out why this was happening. Still, it was obvious that the symbionts had somehow seized full power on the planet and had either stolen or developed technology, which was quite advanced for an isolated colony. The fact that the symbionts had been able to develop intelligence was so incredible that 813th had no choice but to accept it without explanation. The only theory she could come up with was an out-of-control genetic experiment, but why the colonist scientists might have set up an experiment to improve the intelligence of the manipulators remained a mystery. The worst part of the situation was that there were still descendants of the colonists on the planet. For the most part, they were utterly degraded and lived a primitive lifestyle, mainly in the parts of the planet that had not been fully exploited by the symbiont frenzy, the area of which was rapidly shrinking under the onslaught of the manipulators' gaunt and predatory technological civilization. Few scouts, however, reported the horrible news that, in some places, the colonists and symbionts had switched roles. It was hard to tell if it was revenge from the inappropriately intelligent manipulators or just a coincidence, but they had learned to breed the degraded descendants of the colonists and made them work for food. It was painful. So far as 813 knew, such a thing had never happened anywhere, not even in the most backward and long-forgotten colonies. Whether the colonists were to blame for this terrible catastrophe or an extremely unlucky coincidence no longer mattered. Such a state of affairs could not be left unnoticed. Emotions overwhelmed the 813, and under their influence, being plunged into a highly excited dance, she made a decision forbidden by all the statutes of the Scout Service. She must try to save everyone she could. The remnants of logic worked, but in a somewhat perverse way. Instead of directing her to the feral colonists who dwelled far from the symbiote's poisonous civilization, a mixture of excitement, compassion, and faulty judgments based on them led her to load up on a shuttle large enough to hold a significant number of converted colonists. Leaving the ship in orbit, against all instructions, in stealth mode under the supervision of the automation, 813th headed straight for one of the disgusting farms where the slave colonists worked for their nefarious masters, having first commanded the automated drones of the descent vehicle that had discovered the farm to begin preparations for evacuation. Enveloped in excitement and indignation, 813th didn't notice that communication with the descent vehicle suddenly broke down. Her only thought now was, "Hold on, sisters, help is coming." The farm was far enough away from the huge, stinking cities of the manipulators, so when 813 passed the open landing hatch and stepped out onto the shuttle ramp, the air of the planet seemed quite acceptable to her. It was nearing evening, and dusk quickly settled in around the farm. Around the shuttle, the barracks of the enslaved colonists were arranged in rows. 813 had to admit that the dwellings the former symbionts had built for their slaves looked comfortable and spacious enough, and not too different in their standards from the typical dwellings throughout the metropolis. Apparently, some instincts were still intact among the frenzied manipulators. That was good. It would be easier to make contact with the colonists, who were even allowed by the symbionts to leave guards and couriers at the entrances to their dwellings. Still, what a tragedy, and what a shame, to be turned into slaves of one's own symbiont servants. 813 spread her wings, about to head for the first of the barracks, and at that moment, a fierce flame engulfed the world around her and herself. "I told you so." Pekka slapped his neighbor on the back, causing Kaupo to stagger and almost drop his propane torch. The beekeeper's hand was heavy, the result of Pekka's inexplicable, stubborn attraction to the massive vintage honey press. This mechanical monstrosity had been in Pekka's family for generations. It had become obsolete 50 years ago, but Pekka stubbornly kept pushing the tight handle, refusing to buy a standard new device with an electric drive. I told you all about this, and I even showed you the damn thing Wilma swatted in the kitchen the day before yesterday. Kaupo turned the valve on the cylinder and began to disconnect the hose with the gas wrench. You told me some stupid flying saucer story and showed me a handful of mangled electronics, like you'd stepped on your youngest's toy. What was I supposed to think? Pekka grinned good-naturedly. Well, you told me exactly what you thought. He did his best to copy his friend's voice. You should stop drinking mead, old man, because you're already seeing some flying devils. Pekka cursed. But I've been sober for a year. You know that. Kaupo shrugged his shoulders and put the burner with a neatly coiled hose on the special mounts on the cart with the gas cylinder. How would I know that? Sobriety is not a feature. It's a lifelong struggle. Okay, don't explode, he said, seeing that Pekka was getting more air in his chest again. I admit I was wrong. You did have some weird shit going on. He looked at the melted, strange metal and plastic object that looked remotely like a beehive in shape and size. The small protrusion at its front was covered with black ash. You know, I almost thought those bees looked different for a moment, like those things from the Sci-Fi movie we saw last month. Pekka snorted dismissively. Don't be silly. You can't believe those fairy tales the movie makers make. It's all for children. He wiped his face with a broad palm stained with soot, only getting more soiled. I'll tell you what, it's all those damn scientists who are making a mess. They're always talking in the newspapers and on TV about bees dying out, but they just want to make us buy their stupid robot crap. When I saw those mechanical bees Wilma swatted, I knew what was up. I rushed to you, but you didn't believe me. And I had nothing else to prove me right. He shook his head. But when I saw those things flying into my hives, I felt uneasy. I looked in one and another, and there it was. I'll be damned. But the bees were swarming, and it's the end of August. So I poked around a bit, and there was this little thing, as small as a toy hive, and these mechanical things were buzzing all around it. So I hit it with a sledgehammer a couple of times, got it really splattered all over the place, and then there was this light from the sky, just like in that TV show. Well, that's when I rushed to you. Pekka took a breath. Thanks for believing me this time, buddy. I won't forget, I promise. Kaupo waved him off. No problem. I saw you're hot like a stove, and you don't seem to smell like mead or beer or anything, so I thought I'd better go check it out. He took another look at the melted object. Are you sure you don't want to report this story somewhere? You know, to the university or something, so that the scientists could come and take a look at it? Pekka spat contemptuously. No way. Report it? The hell I'm going to tell them. You know what I'll do instead? I'll sue them. Oh boy, I really will. He slapped himself on the thigh. I can't let them get away with something like this. They've got a lot of nerve with their stupid science. To think they're going to take my bees away from me, bloody brainiacs. I'll have them swarming within the court from August and all year long.